Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're just giving everyone a few minutes to join, and then we will get started. As you come in, you can introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, your country, and your organization if you want to share that information as well. Hi, everyone. We're just giving everyone a minute to join. Feel free to introduce yourselves as you come in the chat. Okay, I think we can get started. Yes, continue to introduce yourselves. Welcome everyone to the IGH Community of Impact webinar on migration and homelessness. My name is Tiffany Connolly. I am the program coordinator at IGH. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your attendance today, especially those of you who are joining very early or very late from where you are. I just have a few housekeeping items for you all. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared after the webinar in follow-up communications. Again, introduce yourselves in the chat as you join the webinar with your name, your country, and your organization, or your city if you want to share that. As the webinar continues, please utilize the chat function to add your commentary, to communicate with one another as the webinar continues. And we ask that you please be thoughtful and respectful as you communicate with one another in the chat. Also, the IGH team will be dropping things in the chat relevant to the discussion, so be on the lookout for that. On your bottom panel, there's a Q&A function. Please submit any questions that you want to be shared during the question and answer portion at the end of the agenda. There's a little thought bubble icon at the bottom that says Q&A. That's where you will put your questions there. And also interpretation for Spanish is available on the same bottom panel. There's a globe icon that you can use to activate that. And I think that is it. Oh, please connect with us on social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can use the hashtag IGHCOI and the hashtag homelessness. And you can also tag us to share commentary about the webinar on social media. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Julia.
Thanks, Tiffany. My name is Julia Wagner, and I'm a program director at IGH. And thank you for joining our Community of Impact webinar series. And And for our community of impact, because it's a learning series, we'll be sharing resources and additional research after this webinar. But to get us started, I just wanted to give a short overview of the common themes around the intersections of migration and homelessness. That this is coming to the international attention more recently, and there's been more research and more programs that are supporting people experiencing homelessness that are migrants. But from the research and from IGH's work, there's still gaps that are there, and there's still more that communities can do. So specifically around the data, there's substantial gaps along the intersections of migration and homelessness. Many national data collection systems don't collect this specific demographic, especially if someone doesn't have citizen status or doesn't have access to public funds. And also, of the available data, there's not the disaggregated data that is needed to inform programs and to provide more specialized programs for migrants. And for this data, communities should consider how to define homelessness that includes a more inclusive definition that includes migrants, and then also develop practices that respect the privacy and confidentiality of migrants, and so that they can kind of access available services, but that we avoid criminalization and other kind of interventions that worsen the problem as well. And so for different countries, the prevalence of homelessness and migration differs. And so each country needs to, and each city needs to measure homelessness, along these intersections to develop evidence-based and data-informed approaches. For migration, many people kind of think of migration as a monolith, and our excellent speakers will kind of get into human-centered and more practices that cities are using. But it's important to think, of this issue as an intersectional issue, and also to kind of look and do interviews and partner with migrants to really understand and have person-centered, human-centered approaches. Migrants experience many issues in communities, including racism and xenophobia, which includes housing discrimination by landlords. Because of not having having rights in communities, they often are subject to unsafe and insecure housing. They have difficulty accessing services. They face financial stability. Lack of language skills can be a large barrier, and impact of immigration status. And also, for this group, it's important to understand each person's needs. For example, women experiencing homelessness that are migrants often can be experienced domestic violence or family instability. So it's important to have services that specifically support these groups. And then, as I said, for the best and effective programs, the people that are migrants should be part of the decision-making process and part of designing programs. So just to give an overview of two cities that have programs along the intersections of migration and homelessness. The first example is Greater Manchester, A Bed Every Night. A Bed Every Night provides self-contained accommodation for anyone sleeping on the street, including migrants. Due to UK regulations, migrants do not have recourse to public funds, so they can't access public services. So A Bed Every Night addresses this by specifically using charitable funds to support migrants. And A Bed Every Night is a government and civil society collaboration working together. And through this program, they have key workers that understand the intersections of migration and homelessness are available at different levels and at each property to provide support. And they provide support to help people regularize their migrant status and help connect migrants to different services, and then also sensitize the different support workers across the network to this issue and how to provide better support services to migrants. And then in Illinois, in the USA, there's a Refugee Action Network that provides a network to raise awareness, to support migrants, and then also to raise this issue with policymakers to let them know the key issues that migrants are facing. And this is a group of individuals and organizations that are working together. So, as I said, we'll be sharing more resources after, but that's my short overview. And now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Lorraine McGrath. She's been the CEO of Simon Community Scotland for 11 years, and she spent just about all of her career in the nonprofit voluntary sector. She's lucky to lead an amazing team who engages more than 800 people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness a year, and the number is rising. She represents the organization and the work on many national and local influencing and policy groups. Thanks, Lorraine, for joining us.
Thanks, Julia. And that's 8,000. That might have been my typo. It's 8,000 people.
8,000 people, yeah.
Apologies if it was my typo. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everybody. I will just share my screen. And hopefully you'll all be able to see.
And you're on mute, Lorraine.
Right, we'll go again.
All set.
Right, so it's telling me that my microphone is automatically muted when I share my screen.
Okay, I think we're okay now. We can see you and we can see your slides. Yeah, sorry for, oh no. Now it I'm not sure why that's happening.
So when sorry to interrupt. So you can share your screen and then I will ask to unmute you once you share, so you can continue to share. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Tiffany, are you able to unmute Lorraine? Otherwise I can share the slides.
Yep, I've pressed the X to unmute, so I think Lorraine,
Yeah,
you're able to unmute yourself now. Okay, I don't know. I think Julia, you might want to share.
okay. Sorry about this.
No, it's okay.
Okay, you can just tell me when to move the slides.
Right, here we go. And we thought we were sorted because we practiced beforehand, but there you go. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I'm really delighted to be talking to you from Glasgow today. I am by no means a technical expert in this very technical area, but I am delighted to talk to you about the perspective of a provider of human rights-based social care responses for people experiencing homelessness as a result of migration to the UK and within the UK as well, in fact, now. So, Julia, if we could just pop along. who are we talking about in UK context? So we're talking about both people from Europe. Since the UK has exited the European Union, we now have a challenge around migration for people who come to the UK from Europe and the European Union. And more recently, that includes 24,000 Ukrainians that Scotland has welcomed since the crisis began there. And we are also talking about people who seek asylum through the immigration system. And right now we've got just over 5,000 people in Scotland within the asylum system. Most of them will not have chosen Scotland. Most of them will have been sent here by the Home Office dispersal system. And the people that we are most concerned with as an organisation and as a country actually in relation to people experiencing destitution are defined as people who are rights exhausted, who have come either through the EU settlement scheme or the asylum process and have not been granted leave to stay and not been granted status. And we estimate that around 500 people at any given time are in Scotland, but that is quite a broad estimation because, as Julia pointed out at the start of the discussion today, the data is very unreliable. It's very, very difficult to identify where people are. People are not captured in the homelessness statistics, etc. So we do have a lot of challenge in just being confident in the numbers of people who are affected by the risk of destitution because of immigration, and destitution obviously leads to homelessness. Thanks, Julia. So Julia touched on this by talking about the Manchester model. The UK system is very highly regulated and carries an awful lot of legislation. It's very complex and it's very challenging for both people from the EU, the European Union and the rest of the world to navigate in terms of seeking asylum or seeking to settle in the UK. The term no recourse to public funds is the UK government's, Westminster government's process to make sure that people who are not deemed to have status are not able to access any public funds or any public support. And it's interesting because the general idea is of the 7,000 people that will be in Scotland at any given time, you know, those that don't achieve status are just left to find their own response to that. And the concept is that they'll go away. They'll leave Britain and they'll go away if there's no support available to them here, which of course is not what happens. Just in the last 24 hours, we have had an even more extreme response being brought in by the UK government, which they call the illegal immigration bill, which will be even more punitive for people who come to the country through more irregular routes, and in particular people who arrive here by small boats via the channel between Britain and France. It is a grim day in Britain's history. It's a very right-wing and very punitive process to apply to people who are seeking asylum in the country. And it undoes an awful lot of the human rights responses that we've had as a nation for many hundreds of years, not just decades. Thanks, Julia. So what does Scotland do? What can Scotland do? We do have our own government in Scotland. However, immigration laws are not devolved to Scotland. They remain with the UK, Westminster. But government in Scotland has been trying really hard to take much more of a human rights approach and to look at what can be done. So there are lots of strategies. Those strategies are difficult to implement in many cases because of the restrictions of the UK government legislation. So we do have an Ending Destitution Together strategy, which brings a very strong human rights-based approach to responding to people who face destitution as a result of the immigration and migration system. That is both connected to and backed up by the Ending Homelessness Together action plan, which I was privileged to be part of developing, and which also identifies that homelessness as a result of immigration and migration is a key area and a key priority for us as a nation, and as a particularly in a focus. If we are going to end homelessness in Scotland, it has to be, we have to focus on ending homelessness for everyone, no matter what their route to homelessness has been. Thanks, Julia. The pandemic, as it did many countries, gave us a whole different opportunity for people affected by the migration system and immigration system. It brought in a whole range of public health protections and, more importantly, money that could be spent as a result. We had the ability to mobilise rapidly, and we were able to bring everybody into accommodation, self-contained quality accommodation, regardless of whether or not, regardless of their status, and particularly for people with no recourse to public funds, absolutely everybody was offered accommodation. Thanks, Julia. But those public health protections came to an end in October 2022, and that gave us a return to the absolute dependence on charity and foundations and grants. The key provider of that charitable response was the Glasgow Night Shelter for destitute asylum seekers in Glasgow. They provided the best that they possibly could, which frankly they would acknowledge was quite grim, on a volunteer base that provided shelter overnight, and no support and no case management, or very little ability to follow up with anybody during the day, in a large derelict building effectively that had been donated to them. And this is just a picture of that. So prior to the pandemic, this was the best that Glasgow could do. During the pandemic, we were able to move on, thanks Julia, to a more dignified approach as we moved from hotel accommodation to a 17-place supported accommodation service, with the building being donated by a local housing association. That meant that we could provide people with a very dignified, much more warm, much more welcoming 24-hour access service with 24-hour staffing and really close connection to the rest of the system in the UK. It's very regulated who can and cannot provide immigration and advice services. So we were able to connect people with the right service, and through intensive case management, 168 guys have passed through those 17 places since October 2020. And we were around 85% of them have had their rights re-established and gone back into the asylum system and back into the Home Office protections. So although people are described as rights exhausted, it's very clear they're not rights exhausted, they're just not rights recognised. The challenge with what we've got here is that it's 17 places. The demand goes far beyond that. The opportunity that we have to do more and reach more and engage with more is very strong. It is a very mixed environment. The age group varies from, late teens to early 20s to people in their 60s, many of whom have been in the country for many, many, many years as they've waited for the outcome of their asylum claim. Many have, as a result of that experience, additional health and physical health and mental health needs that continue to escalate because of the impact of being within the system has had on them. The risk of exploitation remains very high, and we need to work on the coordinated response. Thanks, Julia. Historically, in Glasgow in particular, there was a degrees of separation. The EU migration was not something that was ever seen as part of the immigration process, and anyone seeking asylum would be supported largely by very specialist charities, and particularly specialist charities that related to countries and cultures and opportunities. What we've done is start to bring some integration and to start to recognise that mainstream homelessness should respond just as effectively to this group as it does to any other. And for that reason, the Glasgow Night Shelter became Safe in Scotland, and then Safe in Scotland became part of Simon Community Scotland, in order for us to support the agenda around migrant homelessness being just as a key area, both nationally and locally, as generic homelessness is. It's no different. It should be responded to with the same level of compassion, care, and human rights-based approach. And that's really why Simon Community Scotland now plays such a large part in the response to migrant homelessness in Scotland. We had already begun to do a lot of work around EU migrants, and we are now integrating an awful lot of specialism through Safe in Scotland for the people that are affected by asylum as well. Thanks, Julia. In terms of what we're trying to do in coming together with Safe in Scotland, that's about just improving opportunities for people, bringing that sense of we can do better by integrating our responses and mainstreaming the issue of migrant homelessness, and hopefully over time bring much more robust and professional collaborative approaches and organisational structures. Thanks, Julia. With that in mind, at the moment, we're only able to support men. We want to be able to support women. We want to transition away from that 17-bed communal setting where so many cultures are mixing and so many different people of different levels of need and complexity are living together, to community-based flats. We are working across all forms of no recourse to public funds and all issues facing people with destitution. We do have a particular history around working with people with particularly complex lives, regardless of what the route to that complex life is. There's a real opportunity for us to really build an evidence base here and to understand much more about what works, and to work with people across Scotland to improve responses to NRPF homelessness in their area. Thanks, Julia. And that leads me to the fact that we are a key partner in a multi-sector national collaborative, and we have a couple of partners on the call at the moment. Laura from Aberdeen, who's part of the delivery for Fairways Scotland. Now, what Fairways does is bring NGO providers, ourselves, Turning Point Scotland, Scottish Refugee Council, a small charity called the Refugee Survival Trust, alongside academics and influence and policy organisations and research organisations and the local authority umbrella body to influence a national strategy around responding with a human rights-based approach at a system level to people experiencing destitution as a result, largely of the immigration system. And it looks across the lens to bring both people affected by the asylum and people affected through the EU migration system together, largely through a housing lens, to make sure that we're able to provide accommodation models across all of the main cities in Scotland and provide ongoing support, intensive case management, and to use the data and evidence that's generated from that to influence the major funders and to influence government and others in how we should respond better to migration, immigration, and in particular, how we can design out destitution from Scotland so that no one need experience destitution and no one need not to be able to be accommodated in a modern society like Scotland. Thanks, Julia. Here's the link to that Ending Destitution Together document and also the Fairway Scotland document. There's loads more to say, but as ever, time is short and I think I probably already ran over. So I'll stop now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorraine, for your presentation and kind of showing the need to have human-centered, human rights-focused approaches, both at the programs and the country level. I think programs like yours show that it is possible to have a dignified and appropriate housing for people, and it's important for us to kind of include migrants in our systems and make sure that their needs are supported. And we'll share the links to your reports afterwards. And then if anyone has a question for Lorraine, we'll have a question and answer section at the end of this webinar. But please put your questions in the chat so that we can make sure to get to them at the end. So now I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker. So Fatima Fernandez coordinates the Human Mobility Agenda for UCLG. She facilitates the implementation of the Lampedusa Charter of the Representation of Local and Regional Governments in Global and Migration and Displacement Governments. Former research fellow at the European Institute for the Mediterranean and the University of Santiago de Compostela, and she has a PhD in regional development and economic integration. Thanks so much, Fatima, for speaking at the webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Lorraine, also for your great presentation before. And hello, everyone. Let me see if I manage to share my own screen, and if I don't go muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
That's perfect then. And can you see this I don't think you can see this in presentation mode yet.
Yes, now we can see it.
Great. So thank you so much. Just in the interest of time, I will skip some parts of my presentation that the two of you already touched upon. But let me just introduce a little bit what United Cities and Local Government is and how our work also connects to migration and homelessness and housing, decent housing, as a broader topic. So United Cities and Local Governments is a global network of networks gathering local and regional governments and their national associations from all over the world. I am speaking from the World Secretariat in Barcelona, Spain, but we have continental sections in all the regions, plus a metropolitan global section. So what our main mission is to promote the role of local governments in many governance processes, which include, of course, migration and housing. And we do this through two main strategies. One is advocacy for decentralization and multi-level cooperation, and the other one is decentralized cooperation, so city-to-city technical exchange. And what I will tell you about today, it's a little bit on the advocacy piece, but mainly on the city-to-city knowledge sharing that indeed allowed us to identify in this case, in the Mediterranean region, what were the main challenges, but also the solutions that local governments were bringing to the global arena in terms of homelessness and migration. First of all, of course, our advocacy in terms of human mobility is summed up in the Lampedusa Charter for Dignified Human Mobility and Territorial Solidarity that was adopted last year and that I will be happy to share later. There we set up a set of principles that should guide any policy, not only relating to migration, but mainly in terms of local, national, and global governance, understanding that intersectionality means that no one should be left behind, regardless of legal or administrative status. In this regard, we, of course, advocate for cities' representations in global debates on human mobility, and of course, concrete mandates and broader resources to address some of the situations they found. I will skip this part of the presentation, just again, make it a little bit swift, but just to let you know that cities has been in the past year more and more present in global conversations about human mobility governance. Cities are committed to the implementation of global frameworks related to migration and refugees, although these are state-led and but they include local governments as stakeholders. And against this background, we have also developed our own strategies to make sure that what local governments are already doing is visible, and also other local governments willing to expand their actions in this area can learn from others and have resources in order to do those. Today, I will focus, although we do have a global scope, and the Lampedusa Charter speaks to the global community, I will bring the example of what we did together with our partners in ICMPD and UN Habitat in an EU-funded project called Mediterranean City-to-City Migration that ran since 2015 until this year. What we did was to accompany around 20 cities in the two shores of the Mediterranean during these years, fostering knowledge among them, but also knowledge within them, within those cities, to identify what were the realities of migration in their territories, but also to map what were the actors that could be helpful in addressing those realities. And then we promoted dialogue and concrete actions in those cities to implement those. It was in this framework that we organized in 2020 a peer learning exchange hosted by the city of Dortmund, where the Institute of Global Homelessness indeed was one of the participants. And we focused on what was the framework of this topic from the point of view of cities, and also what they were doing very concretely. The concept that is central to this conversation for us is the right to the city for all. So everyone should have the right, but also access to enjoy and to participate in the services and in the activities in the spaces of the city. And this, of course, includes access to adequate housing, which is recognized yet not implemented everywhere. So among the barriers that we identified among the cities that were participating in that event, some of those you already mentioned, and of course they are all intersectional and cannot be. So the situation of migrants and refugees regarding homelessness and housing barriers cannot be detached from the situation that other people in vulnerable situations that don't have a migrant origin are facing in terms of access to housing. But of course, we did find out through the experiences of our cities, and of course through further evidence that we mobilized in that peer learning, was that irregular administrative status was also adding to that set of vulnerabilities that make some part of the population more prone to find themselves in homelessness. So of course, while acknowledging this situation, and while often having the willingness to address it, cities often find themselves without enough competencies, enough mandates, or enough resources to address those. Also, sometimes they also mentioned, and I think that this connects very much to what Julia was mentioning at the beginning, the lack of data, the lack of proper evidence sometimes makes it also difficult to predict not only the quantities of the fluxes, but also the concrete necessities that will be, that depending on the kind of population will be touching the populations that are in need of housing solutions. Of course, the limited housing stock in general, and of course, the financialization of the housing system should be addressed in order to understand how cities felt about this phenomenon. But of course, they did find out and they did show that despite that lack of competencies, there are many avenues through which local governments can at least ease the situation or facilitate the transition to dignified solutions for people in situation of homelessness. Sometimes it had to do with access to proper information, and this is critical for people coming from other countries. And there are information not only in terms of the rights or the facilities that are available at the public facilities that are available at municipal level, but also actors that could help them, like from civil society or charity institutions and so on, that they could benefit from. In this same direction, exploring partnerships, sometimes with civil society, charities and others, but also in some cases with the private sectors, what was one of the solutions that the cities brought to the table. And of course, addressing and ending discrimination from a proactive point of view, acknowledging the fact that many people in situation of migration had it very difficult to get access to decent housing, even when they had the means to get a house, just because of these xenophobic and discrimination approaches. Of course, then, regarding social housing and vacant stock in cities was also addressed, and connected to the discrimination aspect. The promotion of inclusion and participation in public space, in activities, economically, and so on, was also definitely highlighted as enabler. And just to finish, I just wanted to conclude by saying that again, and I'll be happy to share further resources, but what we try to do and what we can bring as a network of networks operates in 2 to 3 layers. One is advocacy, just collecting what is happening in different territories, of course, with very diverse situation, and finding what is common in order to elevate that to states, but also to the UN system, right? Just last week at the high-level political forum, where among others, SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities was being evaluated, we brought 5 papers, among which one was on housing as one of the key targets of Objective 11, and with its different dimensions, and of course also tackling the migration aspect. But together with advocacy, we do promote city-to-city cooperation with 2 goals again: for cities to really get knowledge from what others are doing, but also for cities to cooperate with other cities and ultimately bringing support to those that are more in need from a solidarity perspective. And finally, sometimes we do manage to also facilitate capacity building in concrete cities for concrete challenges that they are addressing, and that many times regard also migration and housing separately or together. And just a couple of examples before I leave, and really, I will be happy to expand on those later or to share some references. But I brought a few different ones. So the first one had to do more with housing for refugees and migrants in Dortmund, but also in the Netherlands. But also together with this, I wanted to highlight, for instance, what Beirut did in 2017, that was to start a sort of coordination unit in order to map all the actors that could accompany migrants, and also to mobilize like neighbor leaders to facilitate inclusion of the people living in those areas. And finally, a very important reality that we have identified in the Mediterranean, and that many cities, for instance, in the south of Spain, but also in Italy and other countries, is the fact that minors that are protected by law until 18, until they turn adults, often find themselves totally vulnerable and unprotected once they turn 18. And without and often when they are going through the migration experience alone, and again, their status of children or minors provides them with a shelter until 18. What happens right after they turn 18 is critical, and they need at that point, of course, to have a job, but you cannot access a job if you don't have a house where to prepare for that job. We know how. So there are many local governments, together with civil society organizations, that are working on that, struggling so much because they do lack the competencies and sometimes the resources, but they do find that that critical point needs to be addressed exactly when they turn 18 and in those first years of adulthood, just as a very concrete example. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Fatima, for your presentation. Spotlighting that, although this is a complex issue, cities can take concrete action. And I think, that learning and sharing component is critical. And, also cities working to coordinate and mobilize partners to kind of make sure that, migrants are supported. And we will definitely share those examples, the Beirut example of coordinating partners, and, making sure that all the partners know about the services across the city. So I think, so thanks again. So I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And so if you have any questions for Lorraine or Fatima, please put them in the Q&A. And I think one question that I have is, for cities that are thinking about, key actions to take on this issue along the intersections of migration and homelessness, what are some key changes in policies that they can make to make a difference? So, for cities just starting out, what are kind of the key policies that they can kind of implement or change to be more inclusive and have a more human-centered approach? Fatima, are you able to kind of talk on this point?
I'll try to. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that the first very relevant point, again, that is not just about what cities can do, which again, I can bring other examples, but really one of the gaps that cities with other stakeholders have been really highlighting in all global fora is the fact that the very few legal, like regular pathways for migration that exist are then create a chain of gaps that then make it impossible almost to really provide targeted solutions in cities, because of course irregularity is connected to informality, and informality is connected to lack of data, but also to precarious conditions, to situations of exploitation, and so on and so on and so forth. So again, like we promote evidence-based policies on migration, also to somehow address that polarization from a very concrete and empirical way. But it's impossible to bring concrete evidence and decentralized evidence and disaggregated data if we are moving in a context of irregularity and informality. And and again, that depends very much on states' willingness to open regular pathways. So although we preach for decent housing conditions, regardless of administrative status continue to be a critical part of the topic. Then, of course, there are like cities have been working in terms of housing policies and social housing, but also then like in terms of migration, addressing discrimination and xenophobia, and like putting those together with successful results. But again, I would definitely highlight that part of regularization. Then, of course, vertical and horizontal coordination. Sometimes we also see national strategies that are very difficult to put in place at local level, even when the goal is exactly to promote, for instance, refugees inclusion in cities, in order to promote longer term and autonomy solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think that points to the fact that, as you said, national governments need policies in place and need to create systems and, laws like the UK just passed, worsen the problem, but the problem still exists, and we need to have, human rights-based approaches. Lorraine, I have a question from the chat. From your experience, what areas of research, are lacking in this issue? What don't we know that we kind of need to do additional research for?
Oh, lots. Loads of stuff we don't know. We don't know what happens to the majority of people when they are not granted status. So people that face destitution, not all of them turn up in the homelessness system. So we don't know where they go. There's a huge amount of hidden concern and most likely hidden exploitation, human trafficking and modern slavery as a result. And we know some of that anecdotally, but we don't know any of it in any kind of really good evidence data. We don't know an awful lot of the detail around the health impacts of what we actually do to people through the migration system and the way that we respond to them when they're in country. And that's one of the things I think some cities could do better, is make it easier for people to get health interventions because the threshold for health and social care access is too high in too many cases, particularly for mental health and trauma, which is one of the biggest things that people experience, of the people that we support. We also don't understand, in the UK in particular, no one's done any real work on understanding what the economic value is of keeping people in the asylum system out of the workforce, and what the economic value could be of allowing them to engage in the workforce. Because so many people come in with who are highly skilled when they arrive in country, and as the longer they're here in the asylum system, they're becoming more and more de-skilled, and we need those skills. So that there's that kind of economic argument as well. I could go on. There are lots of evidence gaps, lots and lots of evidence gaps. Some of them are much more harder much more difficult to fill than others.
Yeah, thank you. I think, that, homelessness is a public health emergency, and migrants experiencing that need access to health services, and then also kind of the job support as well is very critical. Question for Fatima. How good are cities that you work with at collecting useful data for this intersection?
Thank you. So, well, I was just responding individually, but what I was just writing is that it depends, of course. It varies a lot on their size, their capacity, their outreach. But in general, we do have different means to collect that data, and we really try to be inclusive. So sometimes we do it through surveys, which is, for instance, how we work in terms of seeing how they implement the 2030 agenda. So we try to use like surveys that based on those targets to address that. And then other times is more through peer learning, when we ask cities to share their experiences or a city practice or so on. We do collect the local practice, but also some of the trends we see. We have some practice database. For instance, we have one that is on migration action that is called the Call to Local Action on Migrants and Refugees, but we have many others. So what we try to do is that for those that don't have available data, we at least have their experiences. So the idea is that we have them talking in communities, and we have a community of practice on migration, and we have a community of practice on housing, and all of that fits our key messages about how cities are doing and what they are expecting in terms of these policies.
Thanks. And I think that shows the need for, the community of practices to support cities to, both share quantitative and qualitative and kind of mechanisms to collect data around these intersections at a, at a regional and international level. Question for Lorraine. What has been done to address the stigma and discrimination and racism against migrants in Scotland?
Not nearly enough. But we are, as a nation, concerned. There has been some research done, public attitudes to people seeking asylum and migrants, and it is largely positive in the response. I can't remember the statistics right now. I can probably try and find it and post the report. It's not that recent, but I can't remember the statistics just now, but it was a positive response. There has been a new Scots strategy that says that Scotland welcomes people, and in particular, that's been kind of reinforced with our welcoming of more Ukrainian refugees than anywhere else in the UK. So there is a lot of positive action and positive rhetoric around welcoming people to Scotland seeking asylum and welcoming refugees. The work that's been done on the ground by so many community groups and charities also supports that, but it's not nearly enough. We still do have a massive problem in terms of public attitudes to migration, which is driven largely by the media and very right-wing politicians being very vocal and making kind of very blithe statements about things that just are not accurate and undermine public confidence and attitudes towards people that are here seeking asylum, and exactly what that looks like and just how grim it is for people to be in that system.
Yes, thank you. And I think some of the economy of support, in the migration system still exists. You can see support to Ukrainians, which is very much needed, but then for people that come from other areas of the world that do experience racism, there's still a lot of lack of support and a lot of xenophobia. And so I think as cities and as communities, we need to make sure that we have some services for all migrants, no matter for every kind of background, including from Africa, from the Middle East, and make sure that we're not kind of criminalizing certain aspects of migrants in our communities. Well, I think we are just about at time. So thank you so much for your engagement, and thank you so much to our speakers, Lorraine and Fatima, for this excellent presentations and for this discussion. We will be sharing resources and kind of follow up, and we have recorded this session and we should be sharing it externally. So thank you all so much, and then we'll continue this conversation next time. But thanks so much to our speakers, and have a great day, everyone.